Why unfinished things start feeling more important than they are. Some things do not stay important because they are truly large. They stay important because they stay open. A message unanswered, a thought unresolved, a decision postponed, a situation that did not fully close inside you. At first, it may be small, just a loose end, a detail, a slight tension that has not yet settled. But once something remains unfinished, the mind begins to organize around its openness. Attention returns to it. Emotion stays near it. Thought keeps circling it. And because it keeps returning, it starts to feel bigger than it originally was. This is the mistake. The mind starts confusing unfinished with important. Not because new evidence appeared, because the thing kept occupying space. And what occupies space begins to feel significant. This is why some of the heaviest things in inner life are not always the deepest. Sometimes they are simply the least concluded. The system does not like what remains open. An open thing keeps asking for position. It keeps pulling attention back toward itself. Not necessarily because it matters most, because it has not been allowed to become still. And once something is mentally active long enough, it starts to acquire a false gravity. Not the gravity of truth, the gravity of recurrence. You think, if I keep returning to this, it must be important. But the return itself is often what creates the feeling of importance. That is where the pattern begins. What makes this pattern so convincing is that unfinished things do not feel neutral. They feel active. They sit in the background. They pull at attention. They create the sense that something is still waiting. And the longer they remain there, the more the mind starts treating them as central. Not because their meaning deepened, because their presence continued. This is the hidden shift. A thing does not have to become more true to become more psychologically heavy. It only has to remain mentally available. Each return adds weight. Each reopening makes the thing feel less like one moment and more like a lasting structure. This is why an unfinished detail can begin to outweigh finished realities. Not because it deserves more importance, because it is still alive inside attention. The mind feels this aliveness and assumes this must matter. But activity is not the same as significance. A thought can stay active because it was left open. A moment can stay emotionally loud because it was repeatedly revisited. A loose end can start feeling enormous simply because it never became still. That is what the mind usually fails to see. It thinks importance created the return, when very often, return created the feeling of importance. This is why unfinished things can begin to feel strangely urgent. Not because they are dangerous, because they are unresolved. The mind does not easily tolerate what has no final shape. It wants closure, position, a sense that the thing has been placed somewhere stable. Until that happens, attention keeps leaning back. Not always dramatically, sometimes just a small return, a quiet checking, a brief mental reopening. But these small returns matter, because every return prevents the thing from becoming background. It stays active. And once something stays active, the system begins to organize around its activity. Mood changes around it. Interpretation starts bending toward it. Other things lose weight beside it. This is how scale gets distorted. What is unfinished starts feeling larger than what is complete. Not because it contains more truth, because it contains more friction. And friction has a way of demanding attention until the mind mistakes demand for importance. That is the threshold. The moment a loose end stops feeling like one small open thing and starts feeling like something central, simply because it refuses to become still. What makes this distortion so hard to detect is that the mind does not experience it as exaggeration. It experiences it as relevance. If something keeps returning, it must still need you. If it keeps pulling at attention, it must still contain something essential. That is how unfinished things gain false authority, not by proving themselves, by remaining mentally available long enough to feel unavoidable. This is why completion often feels lighter than incompletion, even when the completed thing was objectively larger. A finished difficulty can start fading. An unfinished detail can keep growing. Because what is finished stops asking for position. What is unfinished keeps pressing for one. And that pressure changes the whole field. The mind does not just revisit the unfinished thing, it starts measuring other things against it. Now what is complete feels dull. What is settled feels less urgent. What is still open feels alive. This is how importance quietly shifts, not toward what is deepest, toward what remains psychologically active enough to keep calling you back. That is why unfinished things can begin to feel more meaningful than they ever were when they first happened. This is why unfinished things can start shaping identity without permission. You do not only think about them, you begin to feel yourself in relation to them. The unanswered thing, the unresolved thing, the thing that still pulls. Now it is not only an open loop in the mind, it becomes part of how the day feels, how the body feels, how attention organizes itself. This is the deeper cost. The unfinished thing starts borrowing importance from repetition and then starts borrowing identity from importance. It begins to feel like, this says something about me. This still matters because of me. This is still active because I have not done something right. That is how scale gets distorted even more. A loose end becomes self-relevant. And once something feels self-relevant, the mind gives it even more energy, more review, more tension, more return. This is why unfinished things can become so sticky, not only because they stayed open, because the mind slowly turned their openness into personal significance. And once that happens, the thing is no longer just unfinished. It starts feeling like it belongs to who you are. This is where the pattern begins to loosen. Not when unfinished things stop existing, but when unfinished is no longer confused with important. That distinction changes everything, because now the pull is still felt, but it is read differently. You no longer assume, if this keeps returning, it must deserve my attention. You begin to ask, what exactly is making this feel so big? And very often, the answer is not depth, it is recurrence, it is friction. It is the fact that the mind kept feeding it with return, review, and emotional availability. Once that is seen, something starts to soften. The unfinished thing does not immediately disappear, but it loses some of its false gravity. It is no longer the unquestioned center of the inner field. It becomes one active thing among others. Still open, still pulling, still not fully placed, but no longer automatically more important than everything else. That is the real shift. Not completion yet, proportion. The ability to see that something can remain unfinished without being given the size of a truth, a crisis, or a definition of the self. And once proportion returns, attention stops kneeling so quickly to what is still unresolved. That is where the mind begins to recover from the spell of unfinished importance. What changes then is not only attention, it is trust. Trust that something can remain open without becoming larger than it is. Trust that unfinished does not automatically mean urgent. Trust that what still pulls does not always deserve to become central. This matters, because once the mind stops kneeling so quickly to what is unresolved, unfinished things lose their false authority. They can still exist. They can still remain partly open, partly active, partly unsettled, but they no longer reorganize the whole field around themselves. And that is enough for something important to return. Scale. The real size of the thing.
The real size of the gap. The real size of the feeling. Not inflated by return, not enlarged by friction, not turned into importance simply because it stayed alive inside attention. That is where the spell breaks. Not when everything closes, when the unfinished stops being mistaken for the most important thing in the room. This is inner cognition.